What's an effective way to figure out how to match your career with your temperament? How can you determine if a job is a good fit or a terrible mistake? Let's start with the first one. Well, the first thing you do, obviously, that you have to do is to understand your temperament to some degree. And so the best way to deal with that is to get yourself assessed using a good Big Five instrument. There's many of them online. It will enable people to get a read of their temperament that will tell them how extroverted they are, how high they are in negative emotion or neuroticism, how agreeable, how conscientious, and how open. But it'll break each of those traits down into two aspects. So extroversion breaks into enthusiasm and assertiveness. Neuroticism breaks into withdrawal and volatility. Agreeableness breaks down into politeness and compassion. Conscientiousness into orderliness and industrious, and openness into openness proper, which is something like creativity and interest in ideas. And so the first thing you have to know is what your temperament is. And the second thing you should probably know, and we'll probably add this functionality to the system at some point, is what your intelligence level is, what your IQ is. Because the higher your IQ, the better suited you are for jobs whose demands change rapidly. And so those are complex jobs, and simple jobs are the jobs where you can learn something and then you can run it as an algorithm. You can just repeat it over and over. And those jobs, of course, are becoming more and more scarce. So you need to know what your temperament is, and then you need to know the temperamental demands of the job. Now, most jobs are mastered with a combination of intelligence and conscientiousness. But the other temperamental factors play a moderating role. So, for example, extroverted people tend to be entertainer types and highly social. And so if you're interested, for example, if you're extroverted, then a career in sales is something that you might consider, or a career that involves a lot of public communication and interaction with groups. Whereas you're an introvert, you're going to want to work a lot more. You're going to be suited to work in a solitary manner a lot more. If you're agreeable, you're going to be suited for taking care of people. If you're disagreeable, then you're a tough bargainer and a hard negotiator, and litigators, for example, lawyers are often low in agreeableness. So if you're conscientious, well, that tends to be a very good trait for any kind of managerial and administrative job, and for simpler jobs as well. It's a great predictor of military prowess, for example. If you're high in openness, then you're going to want a creative career, and that might make you an entrepreneur or a musician or an artist of that, or something like that. That's often very, very difficult to monetize. But one of the funny things about openness is that if you're high in openness, it's not that helpful at the bottom of hierarchies, because you're basically expected at the bottom of most hierarchies to act more or less like a functionary, but it becomes of critical importance at the top of hierarchies. So it's a personality trait whose utility can really kick in the later stages of your career, because in really complex positions where things are changing dynamically, you need to have a high intelligence, and you also need to be creative. So how can you determine if a job is a good fit or a terrible mistake? Well, I would say you can tell if it's a terrible mistake if you dread going, and also if you're working hard and doing what you're supposed to and you're not being rewarded for it, and there's no chance for advancement. So those are good reasons to leave. So all right.
Like, make a plan, man. So when I was doing my clinical work, which I did a lot of career work with my clients, both at a beginner level, I would say, like really a beginner level, with people who had no employment whatsoever, no history of employment, who were undereducated and who lacked every skill you could possibly imagine. So these are people who were really in dire straits, up to people who were operating at the top of their profession, but who could still strategize forward. And so, for example, let's say you're at a dead end in your job. Okay, so I don't find my work meaningful. All right, so that's a problem statement. It's like, well, why not? I find the work I do repetitive and boring and without spirit. I have a bad relationship or a neutral relationship with my boss who doesn't know who I am. I have problems with coworkers. All of that needs to be differentiated, right, and analyzed in detail. So we might say, for example, let's say you believe that you're undervalued at work, and maybe you are. What you need to do is you have something to say. And we would have to figure out what it is that you have to say. But it would be some variant of, I'm bringing more value to the table than I'm being compensated for. And that's demoralizing me. And it's also not good for you, you being my boss, because if I'm actually more valuable than is being recognized, then the fact that you're not valuing me properly means that I will become demoralized. I won't work properly and you won't get the best out of me. So it's bad for both of us. And if your boss is in principle not amenable to such a discussion, then what you should seriously consider doing is finding another job. Okay, so let's say we're going to set you up for this. Okay, this isn't like next week's enterprise, man. This is your life. So the first thing I would ask is, well, do you have your resume or CV in order? Well, I haven't typed it up for 3 years. Well, what do you think about bringing it up? Well, I'm pretty nervous about that because there's some holes in it. And, I didn't do so well in college and I'm kind of embarrassed about my resume. It's like, okay, bring it in. Let's go through it. Let's at least update it. Let's look where the holes are. Let's look at where the inadequacies are as far as you're concerned, right? This isn't my judgment. It's your judgment. Let's walk through those judgments and see if they're warranted, because maybe you're just too guilty and ashamed and self-conscious and anxious and you're looking at your resume more critically than someone else would. And maybe there's some holes that you need to rectify. You were 2 courses away from your BA and you dropped out or something like that. Well, maybe we need 6 months to address that. And at least, even if you can't be fully educated, you could be taking some courses online. And so when you went to a new job interview and they said, what about this hole? You'd say, well, I came to terms with that 6 months ago, and in an effort to rectify it, I'm taking the following courses, and here's my plan for completion. That's a really good answer. And anyone with any sense who's interviewing will accept that as an indication that although you're not perfect, and who is, that you have a good plan and that you've thought it through. Like, that's the kind of answer that in all likelihood will cement your candidacy for the position. Okay, so now you're going to go to your boss. Well, you have to have your CV and your resume in order, and you have to be able to stand on it solidly, and which at least means that you're prepared to address the inadequacies in a credible, realistic, believable, and truthful manner. All right, now what you do is apply for like 10 jobs. You don't have to take them, but maybe you have to go to an interview or 2 or 3 or 4, and maybe there's a bunch of opportunities out there for you that you didn't even know about. And maybe someone offers you a job. And so now you can go to your boss and say, here's the situation I'm in here at work. Here's my evaluation of the problems in relationship to me. Here's what I could do for you if you gave me a 40% raise and the opportunity to progress, but I'd like to see a plan for that. And I've been looking for other opportunities before conducting this discussion, and I have some. Well, then, if your boss treats you with contempt at that point and doesn't listen, then perhaps he or she is a little more narcissistic than might be optimal, and it's time to find a new job. But this isn't something you do trivially. And so when you're doubtful, say you're trapped, you ask yourself, well, why am I trapped? And that's a hard question, right? Because some of it's your own inadequacy, a lot of it. And all of the part of it that you can deal with is your own inadequacy. So even if it's unfair, even if you're hemmed in for any number of reasons, inappropriate, like ethnically predicated oppression, let's say, or maybe you're in a workplace that really is sexist in some fundamental sense. Well, that's not good. It's not just. It's not fair. It's not meritorious. All of those things. And maybe you shouldn't be there. But what you can do to begin with is every bloody thing you possibly can do to put yourself in the most virtuous and powerful negotiating position possible. And you have to think like a snake in some sense to do that. You got to get the details right. You have to be prepared to bite, and you have to have your eyes on the prize, so to speak. And people aren't taught this sort of thing ever, really. They're not taught how to negotiate. They're not taught how to goal set. They're not taught how to conceptualize appropriate success in some broad sense. In some sense, that's what the humanities are supposed to teach people.
First of all, you need to know them for your own life. because you got to know that there are differences in intelligence. It's really important. If you go into a job and you're not smart enough for that job, you're going to have one bloody miserable time. And you're going to make life wretched for the people around you because you won't be able to handle the position. And as you climb hierarchies of competence, the demand on fluid intelligence increases. And so, unless you want to fail, you don't put yourself in over your head. Well, what's over your head? Well, that's a tricky thing to figure out. I mean, you have to figure that out with intelligence, you have to figure it out with conscientiousness, you have to figure it out with creativity, you have to figure out with stress tolerance, with agreeableness, because you want to go into a cooperative environment and not a competitive one if you're agreeable, and with neuroticism, you probably want to keep the stress level of your job relatively low, because those are all places that you can break down. And most people have at least one significant weakness in their intelligence personality makeup, and you got to be careful not to place yourself in a position where that's going to be a fatal flaw. But what you really want to do, as far as I can tell, if you want to maximize your chances for both success and let's say well-being, is you want to find a strata of occupation in which you would have an intelligence that would put you in the upper quartile. That's perfect. Then you're a big fish in a small pond. And you don't want to be the stupidest guy in the room. It's a bloody rough place to be. So, and you probably don't want to be the smartest guy in the room either, because what that probably means is you should be in a different room, right? You should look at a place where, if you're right at the top, you've mastered it. It's time to go somewhere where you're a little lower so that you've got something to climb up for. So, and if you're not hyper conscientious, for example, you're probably not going to want a job that you have to work 70 hours a week at, because you're just not wired up that way. You'd rather have some leisure, and like, more power to you. If that's how you're wired up, there's nothing wrong with having some leisure. But if you're someone who can't stand sitting around doing nothing ever, then maybe you can go into a job that's going to require you to work 75 hours a week. And almost all jobs that are at the top of complex dominance hierarchies require very high intelligence and insane levels of conscientiousness, as well, generally speaking, as pretty damn high levels of stress tolerance. You know, because that can knock you out too, because there's going to be sharp fluctuations in your career, generally speaking, at the higher levels of a structure, and you have to make very complicated decisions, often with very short time horizons. So you have to decide if that's what you want. So, okay, so how smart do you have to be different things in life? Well, if you have an IQ of 116 to 130, which is 85th percentile and above, so it's one person in 8 up to one person in 130, I believe, is 85, 90, 95? Is it 95? I think it's 95. One person in 8 to one person in 20. Then you can be an attorney, a research analyst, an editor, an advertising manager, a chemist, an engineer, an executive manager, etc. Now, that's not the high end for IQ, by the way. You know, that it can go up, well, it can go up indefinitely, although there's fewer and fewer people as it goes up. So if you want to be the best at what you're doing, bar none, then having an IQ of above 145 is a necessity, and maybe you're pushing 160 in some situations, and maybe that's making you one person in 10,000 or even one person in 100,000. And then also, to really be good at it, you probably have to be reasonably stress tolerant and also somewhat conscientious. So you know, people, well, you think, well, why is it that smart people are at the top of dominance hierarchies? And the answer to that in part is because they get there first, right? I mean, everything's a race, roughly speaking, and the faster you are, the more likely you are to be at the forefront of the pack. And intelligence in large part is speed. That's not all of it is. So if you're moving towards something difficult rapidly, the faster people are going to get there first. So IQ of 110 to 115, so that's 85th to 73rd to 85th percentile. Copywriter, accountant, manager, sales analyst, general manager, purchasing agent, registered nurse, sales account executive. If you look at universities, the smartest people they're above this. Who are the smartest people at university? What do you think? Mathematicians. Physicists and mathematicians, right. I could tell you who's on the other end, but I won't. Yeah, I'd like to though. Anyways, okay. Going down now 103 to 108 is slightly above average, right? 60th to 70th percentile. Store manager, bookkeeper, credit clerk, lab tester, general sales, telephone sales, accounting clerk, computer operator, customer service rep, technician, clerk, typist. So you see at this level, people have some technical skill and some ability to deal with complex things. Okay, that's dead average. 100 is average. Dispatcher in a general office, police patrol officer, receptionist, cashier, general clerical, inside sales clerk, meter reader, printer, teller, data entry, electrical helper. 95th to 98. Machinist, food department manager, quality control checker, security guard, unskilled labor, maintenance, arc welder, die setter, mechanic. Good IQ range for relatively qualified tradespeople. 87 to 93. Messenger, factory production worker, assembler, food service worker, nurse's aide, warehouseman, custodian, janitor, material handler, packer. Now, what you're starting to see is that as you move down the hierarchy, the jobs get simpler, they're more likely to be assigned by other people, or they're repetitive. Because what IQ predicts to some degree is how rapidly you can learn something, but once you've learned it, it doesn't predict necessarily how well you do at it. And so the more repetitive jobs people with lower IQs are more suited to more repetitive jobs. Under 87, is there something? Well, no. Right. That's a big problem. And it's something our society has not addressed at all. Jobs for people with IQs of less than 85 are very, very rare. So what the hell are those people supposed to do? It's 15% of the population. What are they supposed to do? Well, we better figure it out, because one of the things that's happening too is that as the high IQ tech geeks get a hold of the world, the demand for cognitive power is increasing, not decreasing, right? You want to be a teller? Well, you know, those checkout machines, they're not so simple. You want to work at McDonald's? You think that's a simple job? You don't see robots working at McDonald's. And the reason for that is that what McDonald's workers do is too complex for robots to do. So this is a discussion that no one wants to have, but that's okay. It's still a problem, and it has to be dealt with. So the US government, I think I told you this at one point already, it's illegal to induct anyone into the US Army if they have an IQ of less than 83, right? It's about 10% of the population. Because the US Army, and they've been doing IQ testing since IQ testing began, because they want everybody they can possibly get into the Army, because in peacetime, they use it as a way of moving people up the socioeconomic ladder, and in wartime, well, obviously, you need as many soldiers as you can get your hands on. And so you're not going to be any pickier than you have to be. So when the US Army says it's illegal to induct anybody into the armed forces if they have an IQ of less than 83, then you know that they've done it for absolute necessity, right? And when people have made a finding that contradicts what they want to hear and they're doing it out of absolute necessity, you can be reasonably true that it's one of those facts that just won't bloody well go away. And so you might think, well, if there's nothing for someone with an IQ of less than 83 to do in the Army, what makes you think that there's something that they can do in the general population? And then the issue is, you know, because the conservatives will say, well, they should just work harder. It's like, sorry, that ain't going to fly. And the liberals will say, well, there's no difference between people anyhow. And you can just train people to do everything. And that's wrong. So they're both wrong. And they're seriously wrong. And the fact that neither side of the political perspective will take a good, cold, hard look at this problem means that we're going to increasingly have a structural problem in our societies, because we're complexifying everything so rapidly that you can't find employment unless you're intelligent. You guys are really going to face this, you know. Lawyers are disappearing like mad. And the reason for that is, you can look it up online. Increasingly, you can do things yourself if you're smart. And so, like, the working class people have been wiped out pretty nicely over the last 30 years by automation and various other things. It's the low end of the white collar class that's coming up next. So I'm not saying that lawyers are in the low end, but low end lawyers are in the low end of the white collar class. So there's still going to be plenty of positions for people who are creative and fast on their feet and super smart. In fact, those people are going to have all the money, and that's already happening to a great degree. You discount the risk of familiarity that they're familiar with. So, like, let's say I have a job I hate. It's like, well, yeah, but I'm not dying from it. It's like not as bad as it can be. So you've factored in the risks already. They get invisible. You think, well, I can't jump out of this job because what about all the risk? It's like, yeah, no kidding. You got to get your resume in order. You got to send it out. You got to send 50 of the damn things out before anybody will call you back. Then you have to go get interviewed, and maybe you're not any good at that. You have to come up with a story while you're a good employee, and maybe you're not yet. So you have to figure out how to do that. It's like, what about all these risks if I go look for a new job? It's like, yeah, absolutely, man. Those are risks, and they're harsh, and no wonder you're avoiding them. What about the risks for you to stay with this job you absolutely hate? Well, let's think that through. Okay, so I have this dead-end job. I hate it. I'm getting bitter. Where am I going to be in 5 years? I know where, because I've watched this with people. You're going to be just like you are now, except a lot more of what's good about you is going to be gone, and a lot more of what's terrible is going to be amplified. And you're going to be like, in 5 years, you're going to be 10 years older instead of 3 years older.
Yeah.
Right. And
because it kills your spirit somehow.
Oh, man. Yeah. So it's like you think, oh, my God, there's a terrible risk in pursuing this new job. It's like, yeah, there is a terrible risk. There's a terrible risk in you staying with your job right now. And so one of the things that's really, really freeing to understand is that you're screwed no matter what you do. There's no secure path forward. Give it up. It's risk everywhere. You think, oh my God, that's terrible. It's like, yes, except for two things. You can pick your risk. That's the first thing. So you get to pick your poison. That's something. And second, you're a lot tougher than you think. So even though there's risk everywhere, if you confront it forthrightly, what you'll find is that you can actually handle the risk. You'll find that when you start a new job, especially if you've stretched yourself a little bit beyond your zone of comfort, that you very much feel like an imposter, right, when you're first there. And then the question is, well, how do you master that? And the answer to that seems to be, well, it seems fairly straightforward. If the place that you're in has any degree of possibility, if it isn't inhabited by demons, so to speak, the best way to act is to lift your aim upward and attempt to get your act together and to tell the truth and to live a meaningful life and to do difficult things, all of that. And that is the best way of mastering a new territory. And in all probability, the degree to which you're able to act that out is precisely proportionate to the degree to which you're going to become a master in that territory. And that sort of thing can happen a lot faster than people think. You know, it's really quite remarkable how fast you can move forward if you can establish yourself somewhere and prove yourself useful, assuming that you're around people to whom proving yourself useful actually matters. Like, I know perfectly well that you can end up in an employment situation where you're punished for your virtues, right? In which case you should just get the hell out of there. And really, you get out of there and you go find somewhere where if you work hard and do what you're supposed to do, you're actually going to be rewarded, right? Because that's not a workplace, that's hell, and you should just leave there.